How does what we do in international education continue to be the best preparation for young people in their next step?
What does all of this mean for Cambridge now and for its schools going forward? Hello, I'm your host. My name is Laura Kahwati and I'm an Education Futures Manager. We created our Brighter Thinking pod to support teachers and school leaders around the world. Each episode brings you helpful advice and interesting conversations from authors, teachers and academics. Today, we are going to be exploring how to prepare students for the future, guided by our insights from our research. All of the links and the information that we discuss today are available in the show notes for your ease. At Cambridge, we have recently published a report, Navigating the Future, Preparing Learners to Thrive in a Changing World. This report captures the voices of thousands of teachers and students from around the globe, and it offers a wealth of perspectives of readiness for the future from those who are at the heart of education. Here today, to give us an overview of the research, I am joined by our special guest for this episode, our Managing Director, Rod Smith. So, welcome, Rod, to the show.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, good to be here.
Okay, so let's get started on today's topic. My first question is, why have we done this research and why now?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really important question. Cambridge has always been, trusted by schools and teachers and learners to be a great curriculum, a great educational experience. It's why we are in 10,000 schools around the world, why millions of students take our curriculum, and why we, kind of trusted by universities around the world for the kind of, curriculum, the education that we're providing students. But I think that trust is hard won but easily lost, and I think it's really incumbent on organisations like us to be continually kind of just taking stock, talking to our schools, talking to our teachers and students, and ensuring that we continue to be really relevant for the future. And I think that, whilst that's always true, I guess, I think at the moment also there's just so much that's being talked about in terms of challenges and changes in the world, and with whether that's the impact of generative AI, whether that's the impact of other forms of technology, or the climate crisis, or geopolitical challenges, more generally, or changes, or these are all things that are impacting, if you like, the world at the moment, and education has to reflect that. So I think we chose this time to kind of run this really substantial consultation program because actually teachers and schools themselves are really having to get their heads around this. How does what they do stay relevant? How does what we do in international education continue to be the best preparation for young people in their next steps? And this is perhaps every generation says this, but at the moment it really feels like there are a lot of really, really significant questions that we as educators have got to get our heads around. And that's why we led this project, and we've been absolutely delighted with the engagement we've had around it.
That's great to hear, and as you say, really important to understand these things in a changing world with lots of big questions around to address as well. So what does this report tell us?
I'd say there's one thing overwhelming, I think, that came out for me from this whole thing is that, yes, there are lots of challenges. Yes, there are lots of changes that all of us are facing into. But actually, more than ever, the role of education, the role of schools, the pivotal central role of teachers, it remains probably more important than ever in terms of the way that we're helping prepare young people. And I think that is even in the light of the fact that clearly that some of the existing traditional educational models are ones we've got to question, we've got to look at. But actually the kind of impact of things like AI, if it's not really being thought alongside of the issues to do with human intelligence as well as AI, or what's the value of community in education, then I think we're only looking at a really small part of the things that we need to prepare young people for. So, look, I think the overwhelming insight from this report for me, and there's lots of really interesting sub-insights, but the overwhelming insight is just how important a great school environment is, how central the teacher still is on helping young people prepare for the future. I think the one thing that maybe is the most significant contextual change is what really struck us through this report is the importance of listening to students in this debate. That student voice is now probably more important than other. And I think there's lots of, assumptions and orthodoxies about that we can really think about again. We were staggered by the level of engagement through this consultation process. We expected it from teachers and from schools, but we were a bit surprised, I think, by just the sheer interest and commitment there's been, from students. 4,000 students who we've worked with on, through this report. 1,000 of whom have literally said that they want to continue to be involved in this process of engaging with us on this topic. They need to be a much more active voice in defining what that future looks like. They're the ultimate beneficiaries. And interestingly, they are looking for some slightly different things. And I think those, actually what the report dives into, whilst it kind of still stresses the things that have always been important, it's really starting to surface those things that young people think are important for their preparedness for the future.
Thank you. And all the more reason to hear those voices, because they have ideas about what they feel is important, as well as those of us who are looking at education from our perspective.
And I think the critical thing is not just to listen, and that's the first step, but actually to act. I think if all you do is listen and you give a kind of forum for that voice to be, heard, at least to begin with, then there has to be action at the end of it as well. I think you'll lose that commitment, that passion, that engagement very quickly if young people don't actually see some things changing as a result of that.
Absolutely. And from reading the report, what did you find was the biggest surprise?
I think, as I mentioned before, I was surprised in a way, I think, by how many of the things that great teachers and great schools and teaching a Cambridge curriculum have been doing for a long time still remain incredibly relevant. So I think maybe I shouldn't have been surprised about that. I think that's been a theme in education for a very long time. But I think so much of the narrative out there in the world at the moment is around change and potentially pessimistic views of what that future could look like. Actually, at the end of this process, I'm hugely more optimistic, actually, about the continuing value of education and international education and great international teachers. And I think finally, for me, probably the issue about, the confidence of young people, actually, that they've got a very strong voice and very strong opinions about what they need, but actually not always the confidence that they are being well prepared for the future. And I think for us, that means we have to keep challenging ourselves about what we are teaching and the skills we are developing. But I think also it's about just communicating a little bit more about, the skills that you do naturally get, what you can do, who you are, how you are, those things that come through a great human experience, a great education, a great curriculum. And actually those things will always help prepare you for the future. So I think just, yes, we do need to adapt, but also we also need to give young people the confidence that they are actually well prepared for a world that is changing.
That's so true. That confidence is so important for young people to feel prepared. And like you said, we can help with that by being really explicit about the skills that are being taught, because although there is that perception that they're not prepared in some areas, in some cases it may be that they are learning skills through subjects. In every single subject, they're learning different skills that can be applied in all subjects, but they might not explicitly understand that that's what's happening.
Look, in the same way that, if you like, implementing just a very content-rich, curriculum without skills is only doing half the job. So is just simply focusing on skills without that underpinning knowledge as well. What is it that you're actually using to apply those skills in ways that are increasingly innovative or creative or challenging? And I think that those two things together are absolutely critical. And that's certainly what universities have always valued, that, when you come to university, you have that foundational knowledge, but you have those skills to be able to apply those in increasingly sophisticated ways. I think that balance is the critical piece. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment on, well, how can we evidence that more effectively? How can we show teachers and young people not just what they're learning, but the skills that they're developing at the same time. So we're in the middle of a really substantial piece of work at the moment to analysing those skills that naturally come out of the different subjects that you're taking. And different subjects actually develop slightly different skills. Actually, that's one of the things that we're diving into, to really be able to surface those things for teachers to be able to focus on them at the appropriate time, but also for learners to be confident that those are the skills that they're developing.
And you talked earlier about the different current challenges that many people perceive in education. Do you think one of the challenges is an idea that generative AI is making knowledge and foundations of knowledge less important?
Yeah, I don't worry about it, but I do recognise it as a phenomenon. I think that actually that recognition is an important part of thinking, well, what do we do about that? I think, it would be foolish to, ignore a world that is clearly, developing in that direction in terms of the power and impact of generative AI. We're just really clear that education has to adapt somewhat to reflect that changed environment. But what's incredibly important, though, is that the things like generative AI and technology generally don't actually make us more stupid. Don't actually, if you like. I mean, I always think back to when was the last time you looked at a book of maps to get you to your destination? It's a long time ago, but I still lose count the number of times I end up in a dead end or in a farmyard somewhere because I've trusted too much in that information that I'm just, mindlessly taking on. So for us, we see an enormous potential in generative AI, but only if it actually empowers learning, if it actually, builds those skills rather than replaces them. So actually we're using it to increase our capabilities, our knowledge, rather than substituting that critical part of finding these things out for ourselves, or at least evaluating that information, looking at it critically, forming our own arguments, our own opinions, disagreeing with each other well. The art of being able to think about different people's perspectives rather than just simply aggregating them into a single point of view. Obviously, I know a subject that's really close to your heart, Laura, as well, how important those communication skills are going to be. And communication that's about consensus, not conflict. So all of these skills alongside the undoubted wealth of information that young people now have access to much, much more readily. Well, how can we use that access to free up time and brain space to be able to do things better, not just to parrot what people have already said elsewhere?
And like you say, those skills of communication, but skills of critical thinking, skills of being able to disagree agreeably, collaborate, all of those things, they can be seen as being learnt through various different subjects. And then that goes for AI as well. If AI is being used in teaching, it can be used, like you say, as a tool to empower or to enhance, or even as a way of teaching critical thinking by looking at the need for fact-checking and seeing hallucinations and things like that in generative AI.
All absolutely right. And I think that the other thing that it really brings it back to me, though, is that how important so many of those skills are not things that you're developing in isolation, but developing with peers, developing with your other students, or with your teachers, or in a social context rather than just simply a learning context. Because a lot of those skills that we're talking about, where that kind of real creativity and innovation and is added, is actually the way that we interact with each other. And again, where oracy comes in, where that ability to build consensus, that disagreeing agreeably, which is a wonderful phrase, that those are developed face to face. Those are developed in communities, and being part of a community of schools. 11,000 schools around the world, a community of teachers, hundreds of thousands of teachers that have got really great ideas about how they can develop those skills, but sharing those insights, sharing those tips, that experience, and then millions of young people. And here an international curriculum is extraordinary, because not only does it create an international mindset, but it creates those opportunities for you to be able to engage with other people in other parts of the world with different cultural perspectives, different views on the kind of topics and issues that we're all going to have to face into. And if we can make those connections in the classroom, but then across the community, I think that's where the real value of education to prepare young people for the future can really be brought to life.
Yes, because education doesn't just happen in the classroom, does it? It happens, learning happens everywhere, and it is lifelong. And we don't only want to focus on knowledge and skills, but we also want to help children with their social and emotional development, which comes about from being part of a community and part of those conversations and teamwork and everything that goes into really good teaching and learning.
Look, and if you do that, if you develop that in school, then actually what you then have, I believe, for your whole life is an openness to learn, and an openness to kind of continue to be kind of embracing those opportunities, which is going to be one of the key skills. Whatever we know now, whatever we can do now, in our lifetimes, we're going to have to be learning a lot of new skills along the way. So it's those habits, it's that enjoyment of learning that which I think is built hugely through community. Those are the skills as well as the knowledge and those attitudes and approaches to learning. Those are the critical things that I think are great school experience, a great curriculum, great teachers. That's where it really works.
So these are all many of the things you've been reflecting on in terms of the report. And so I wonder, what does all of this mean for Cambridge now and for its schools going forward?
Yeah. Look, I mean, as I said earlier on, it's not enough to listen. It's got to lead. It's got to lead somewhere. We have to protect what we know is foundational and has always been important in education. We mustn't chase the latest issues and ignore those things that have always been at the heart of good education. Yes, that we have to remember. But we also have to think about, well, what is it that we need to change over time? And actually, the critical thing is that we don't. That we do that with our community, that we do that with schools and teachers and learners, and continue this conversation, continue these processes of, if you like, defining the future together. I mean, that's one of the great things I think about education. It creates this sense that actually we don't have to be passive recipients of a future. We can develop it. We can define what a preferred future is and develop that together. What will that look like? I think it will mean over the next 3, 4, 5 years, these things will start to become deeply embedded in the Cambridge curriculum. We can continue to build these kinds of skills, not opportunistically, but in a very planned way, and really make those clearer and clearer for our community of teachers and for the learners themselves. So you'll start to see these things much more explicit in the curriculum, I think. We'll be doing a lot, I think, around supporting teachers in how do you develop these skills, these capabilities more explicitly. So a lot of a focus, I think, on how we support teachers is going to be critical around that. We're really keen to build a community of students around the Cambridge curriculum as well, and we're going to be launching, our own. We've engaged already with 4,000, and we've got 900 that are really keen to continue that conversation. Well, they're going to be the heart of our new student community that's going to help us be really clear about what we've got to do to be better. But all of this, I think, comes around this idea about how can we, if you like, marshal the great potential in this community of schools and teachers and learners to just change, actually what it is we're asking people to learn in a very clear and developmental way. And then what are all the kinds of, what does that mean for our publishing? What does that mean for our teacher development? What does that mean for our school improvement models? With what can we do with school leaders? These are all things, when you think just beyond what are the subjects we're doing with Cambridge, well, these are the things that we can work on together to build that wider community of best practice to deliver this vision.
That's a lot to think about. And I think the schools and the teachers and the school leaders who are listening today can also be thinking about the fact that as they're hearing this, they are not alone in their communities as well. And they might have plans for moving forward after hearing the report too. We have a community of 10,000 here to help. And in each section of the report, we've got a how to get started section. And we'll also be building on this research with student consultative forums and global summits and skills profiles as well. So thank you so much, Rod, for talking to me today about the report. And thank you so much as well for embedding this idea that what's really important at the heart of it is building a love of learning for everyone.
Well, look, just ending on a thank you. I want to thank you, everyone that's been involved in putting this report together, but in particular, actually, the teachers and students that have really engaged, with us on this. And funnily enough, in a world where sometimes I think pessimism is the predominant narrative about the future, actually, for me, I'm hugely optimistic at the end of this process, and mostly because I think, we have this ability to bring together lots of people to think about what we think the future needs to be, not what we're afraid it might be.
Our preferred future.
Exactly. Thank you.